Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 9 of Pakistan Studies. The topic is Muslim Politics and Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. Chaudhry Rahmat Ali made a significant contribution to the movement for the establishment of Pakistan. He was conscious of the Muslim identity and proposed the partition of India for protection of Muslims. Chaudhry Rahmat Ali coined the word Pakistan in 1933 in his writings. When he presented his proposal for creating a Muslim state called Pakistan, nobody took it seriously. Some of the leaders, including the Muslim leaders, described this as a student's proposal and did not take it seriously. However, in 1940, when the Muslim League passed a resolution in Lahore for a separate Muslim state, it was straight away described by media people, by everybody, as the Pakistan resolution. We shall be discussing the contribution of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali towards Pakistan movement, and in this connection we will be focusing on number of topics. One, background, that is the context in which Chaudhry Rahmat Ali presented his ideas. Second, we will provide a brief biography of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. Third, we will talk about Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's views and his proposals for the future of Muslims of British India. Fourth and last, we will talk about the role and impact of his ideas in that movement. Coming to the first aspect of today's talk, that is background and context. In order to understand Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's proposal for Pakistan and his ideas about the future of Muslims of British India, we have to take into account the overall political context that was prevailing in the late 20s and the early 30s. You would recall that by 1924, Khilafat movement receded in the background. Different Muslim organizations became active, began to reorganize themselves, and began to present their views on the problems and issues and interests of the Muslims. In our previous lectures, we have talked about the Delhi Muslim proposals, that Muslim leaders gathered at Delhi and prepared a formula for the future constitution of India. Basically, they provided guidelines, and we have discussed that. We have also noted the efforts of the Muslim leaders to bring about some changes in the Nehru Report. We have talked about the 14 points of the Qaid-e-Azam, which were a charter of the demand of the Muslims. If you put Nehru report on one side and Jinnah's 14 points on the other side and compare the two, you can find two different perspectives, two different worldviews on how should new constitutional system be evolved in India. That showed the two different directions in which the major communities were going. The political demands were conflicting. We have talked about Simon Commission briefly. Today I want to discuss very briefly, not in detail, some recommendations of the Simon Commission in order to put the political developments of that era in a proper context. The British had sent a commission, all-white commission, all-British commission, to visit India and suggest proposals for constitutional changes the British wanted to introduce in India. This commission was boycotted by most Indian political organizations. Few of them did appear before the commission, but most did not. Simon Commission presented some constitutional reforms, and I will outline some of these which were important for Muslims. First, the Simon Commission suggested that there must be a federal system in India with autonomy to the provinces, and the center should not interfere in day-to-day affairs of the provinces unless it is very important. And the suggestions were introduction of representative governments at the provincial level. The second important proposal was that the system of diarchy that existed at the provincial level was to be abolished from provinces. System of diarchy was introduced under the Government of India Act 1919, whereby some of the provincial government departments were assigned to ministers who were subject to the provincial legislative council or were answerable to them, whereas some departments were with the members of the executive council who were answerable only to the governor. So in a way it was division of subjects between the ministers and others who were responsible only to the governor. This provision was done away with in the proposals of Simon Commission. Third, on the question of making Sindh a separate province, the suggestion of the Simon Commission was that a special committee should be appointed that would look into the issue about Sindh and another province, Orissa. The next recommendation was that some constitutional reforms can be introduced in the northwest frontier province. So far as center was concerned, the Simon Commission did not suggest any significant change. More or less, the system was retained at the central level. The changes were mainly at the provincial level. The Simon Commission also suggested that instead of sending commissions after, say, 10 years to India for reviewing constitution and suggesting changes, there has to be a built-in system whereby changes can be made whenever they are needed, rather than sending a delegation like Simon Commission, goes there, investigates, and then reports back. So there have to be a mechanism built into the system which takes care of this need so far as India was concerned. So these were the Simon Commission proposals in brief. Now these same questions, Constitution of India, the future shape of political arrangements, were discussed in 3 roundtable conferences which were held in London in 1930, 31 and 32. In these 3 roundtable conferences, where Indian leaders were there, the British government people were there, and they were discussing the political and constitutional issues relating to India. 3 types of issues came up for discussion in these 3 roundtable conferences. 1, the question of federalism in India. What type of federation has to be created? Second, the Hindu-Muslim question. How would you deal with the question of relationship between the 2 communities in constitutional and the political matters? The third issue was in a way extension of the second one, the question of minorities and their rights. This involved not only Muslims but several other communities which were a minority. So the question was, what kind of rights you want to give to these minorities? No broad agreement was possible between the Muslims, the Muslim League, and the Congress leadership, because they diverged on these issues, especially the question of minorities and the nature of federalism. While these conferences was going on, the British government decided that instead of waiting for these leaders to agree on certain things, they should move ahead and offer a proposal, suggestion for providing representation to different communities in the legislature and government. Therefore, in August 1932, the British government announced what is often described as the Communal Award, and this was announced by British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. The first principle of the Communal Award was separate electorate, not only for Muslims but also for other minorities. Muslims already had this right going back to 1909, principle of separate electorate. But now the Communal Award, announced by Ramsay MacDonald, extends the scope of this principle and applies to other communities that existed in India. And this was a very important development, and also a development that caused some controversy. Second, weightage was to be given to the minorities. Weightage means that the minorities would be given representation in the legislative or elected bodies more than the ratio of their population, so that they can have effective representation. So the principle of weightage was introduced or was offered in this communal award. 3. In the case of Punjab and Bengal, Muslims were not to have the majority of seats in the legislative bodies. The reason being that when weightage is given to minorities, that is, when minorities are given more seats, obviously the majority loses some of its seats. So this principle was incorporated. Another provision in the communal award was that there would be 1/3 representation of Muslims in the central legislature. Another recommendation that in services, in government services, Muslim representation was to be 1/4, that is 25%. The communal award also recommended that Sindh be separated from Bombay province and made into a separate province. One of the recommendations caused a lot of controversy and opposition from the Congress. This was the recommendation about separate electorate and its application to other communities. The low-caste Hindus were also granted separate electorate, to which the Congress objected to. Low-caste Hindus can be described in modern time terms as Dalits, as this title is used for them now in India. The Congress objection was that by giving low-caste Hindus separate representation, the British have divided the Hindus. In order to register the Congress protest, Gandhi decided to go on fast unto death. As the health of Gandhi deteriorated, the Congress leaders and the leaders of the low-caste Hindus negotiated and came to an understanding that separate electorate will not be granted to low-caste Hindus. They will be counted in the category of Hindus. This agreement, what is known as the Pune Agreement of September 1932, saved this crisis and also saved the life of Gandhi, who was pursuing his fast unto death and his health condition had deteriorated. With this understanding between the low-caste Hindus and the Congress party, the issue of separate electorate ended so far as the Hindu community was concerned, but the Muslims were to be granted separate electorate as suggested in the communal award announced by the British government. After this issue was settled between the low caste Hindus and the Congress party, the British government decided to put together different proposals about the future of constitution together, so that the people have an idea of the type of the constitution that was to emerge. Therefore, the British government issued a white paper on constitutional proposals in 1933. The month was March. And in order to understand this white paper on constitutional proposal, one has to keep in mind the Simon Commission recommendations, the discussions and deliberations of the 3 Roundtable Conferences, and also the Communal Award, and then agreement between Congress and the low caste. So these proposals were put together in the form of a white paper, and then the British Parliament deliberated on it. A select committee of the British Parliament gave its report on the future Constitution of India in November 1934. And then this was taken up by the British Parliament, and a new law labelled as the Government of India Act 1935 was approved by the Parliament, and this was signed by the King in August 1935, and that is why that law is labelled as the Government of India Act 1935. Now, if you look at all this constitutional dialogue and constitutional debate, there are a couple of issues that appeared repeatedly. First, the Muslim identity issue. Is it a separate identity? And if it is a separate identity, what are its interests? What are the implications of distinct identity on constitutional and political issues? The second theme that runs through the period is the question of relations between the 2 major communities. What kind of relationship they would have in the political domain. Third thing, which is very obvious from all these developments that we have discussed today, a lack of understanding, a lack of confidence, and an absence of sense of accommodation, because the 2 communities were moving on 2 different assumptions. Muslims were arguing themselves to be a separate nation, a separate identity with separate interests, whereas the Congress was arguing that there is only one nation, that is Indian nation, and therefore this question whether you follow this religion or that religion is not significant, is not important. Therefore, when it is not important, there is no question of Muslim having a distinct or separate rights or separate interests. And by this time, we are talking of mid-30s, by this time, the question of Muslim identity had developed very sharply, and Muslim leaders and intellectuals were thinking about the solutions. First, they had the consciousness of this identity, then how to protect that, and what are the solutions for the future of India in order to incorporate this identity, and how to ensure a secure future for Muslims. That was the key concern. It is with reference to this concern, how to have a secure future for Muslims of India, that we can talk about different proposals which were given by Muslim leaders at different times about the political future of Muslims of India. We have talked about the proposal given by Allama Iqbal in lecture number 8. And here, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali becomes relevant because he had presented a proposal. In fact, there were many proposals, several proposals about the political future of Muslims of India. But here we are talking of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, his proposal, his ideas, when he talked about Pakistan as a state for Muslims. Let's now move on to the biography of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. And I'm briefly talking about his biography because generally people don't know much about him. He has remained somewhat neglected in the study. Chaudhry Rahmat Ali was born in Hoshiarpur district in 1893. His initial education was traditional, the way families used to educate their children at that time. We are talking of 1893 onwards, that is the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Generally, Muslim families would educate their children through the traditional way. You would learn Islam, Islamiyat, you will read Quran, you will read Persian, you will read Urdu. That's how Chaudhry Rahmat Ali got his initial education. He got his BA degree, graduation degree, from Islamia College, Lahore. Later, he did government and private service. But he was not happy with his situation. Therefore, he decided to go to England for higher education. He went to Cambridge University. Cambridge University is one of the oldest universities of England. He went there, joined the university. In that university at that time, there were other Muslim students. So Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, along with other Muslim students, became active in Muslim politics. His concern and his activism was also focusing on the issues that were of much concern to Muslim intellectuals as well as the Muslim leaders. That is the issue of Muslim rights, identity, and nationhood, and how to protect that identity in an adequate and sufficient manner. That was the concern which was considered by Chaudhry Rahmat Ali and his fellow students at Cambridge University. Chaudhry Rahmat Ali was active regarding Muslim interest during his student days in Lahore, that is before going to Cambridge. He was very conscious of the Muslim rights, and he was advocating Muslim interest and Muslim rights as a student. Obviously, he did not get much attention at that time. He said during that time, when he was student in Lahore, that is before going to England, that northwestern India is predominantly Muslim. And he was right. In the northwestern regions of India, Muslims were in a majority. He said that we will not only preserve and maintain this majority, but would turn this into a Muslim state, because in these regions, Muslims are in a majority. In fact, that has moved me on to the next section of this lecture, that is his ideas, his thoughts, and activities which he undertook. I have described that even before going to Cambridge, he had developed certain definite ideas about Muslims and what should be the future of Muslims. These ideas were further articulated and shaped during his stay in England at Cambridge. He discussed these things with fellow students, with Muslims that were living there, or Muslims who were coming from India to England for one reason or the other. Because of all this discussion, he decided to write a small pamphlet, a booklet. The title of that booklet was Now or Never. Now or Never. This was published in 1933, where he briefly summarizes his views about the political future of Muslims of India, and he talks about partition of India. The major credit to Chaudhry Rahmat Ali is that he coined the word Pakistan. And how did he do it? He picked up the first letter from the Muslim majority province of North India and made the word Pakistan. Let me explain this. Pe came from Punjab. Alif came from Afghania, which is northwest frontier province. K, third letter, comes from Kashmir. He saw Kashmir as part of Pakistan. Seen comes from Sindh. And Tan comes from Balochistan, the last three letters of Balochistan, Tan. In this way, he coined the phrase Pakistan. In English, P comes from Punjab, A comes from Afghania, frontier province, K comes from Kashmir, S from Sindh, Tan comes from Balochistan, the last three letters, Balochistan, T-A-N. And he put these words together and it became Pakistan. When he presented this proposal, nobody gave much attention to this proposal. They thought that it is a student's proposal, and therefore not much attention was paid to this. Chaudhry Rahmat Ali was of the view that India cannot be described as one country or one nation, because Indian state as it existed at that time was not there before the advent of the British. It is the British rule that brought most of India, almost all of India, under its direct or indirect control. Before the British, such administrative and political entity called India did not exist. So his argument was that notion of united India, a united nation, Indians, is the creation and the product of British rule. Therefore, it is not genuine. It is not on sound footing. It doesn't really have long historical roots. Otherwise, India was not a single administrative unit. And on that basis, he says that India could not be treated as one administrative unit, one state, or one nation. To Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, Muslims were a distinct nation that has maintained, that has preserved, that has protected its identity throughout. You go back to the past, look at the history, even before the British. Muslims maintained a separate identity. The inner core of the Muslim identity remained distinct. And therefore, Muslims are a separate nation. They have as much right to live as a nation as do Hindus. If they have a right to live as a nation, as a political entity, because nation is a political entity. So if they have a right to be a nation and they demand certain constitutional and political changes from the British, then Muslims as a nation has a similar right. And Pakistan was to be the homeland of the Muslims. Pakistan, comprising the territories which I have indicated while discussing its name, all these territories are to comprise Pakistan. Pakistan or territories identified by him as Pakistan are to be separated from the rest of India. According to him, the conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims was not a conflict of religion, sectarianism, or economic. It was an international conflict, a conflict between two nations. So you can't brush that aside simply by saying that it's a communal thing, two communities are fighting, or it's a religious conflict. To him, this was a conflict between two nations, and Muslims were one such nation. In his view, the Muslims were fighting for survival, survival as a nation, survival as a distinct culture and civilization, and Hindus were trying for domination. Hindus were trying to overwhelm the system. Chaudhry Rahmat Ali lived to see the establishment of Pakistan. This is unlike Allama Iqbal. Allama Iqbal died in 1938, and the dream which he saw at Allahabad in 1930 materialized in a more comprehensive manner after his death. In case of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, he was alive when Pakistan, the name which he had coined, became a reality. But he was living in England at that time. He visited Pakistan in 1948. He stayed here for some time. Then he decided to go back. He decided to return to England, go back to Cambridge, and live there. He did not decide to settle down in Pakistan, although Pakistan had the name coined by him. At Cambridge, he died on 11th February 1951. He is buried in Cambridge. In fact, his grave is very clearly identified in a graveyard in Cambridge, which has stone telling about his date of birth and the date he died, and that he coined the word Pakistan. Not many people visit his grave, but the grave is very much intact, of a person who was an important personality in the freedom movement or the Muslim struggle for Pakistan. Now we move on to the last section, section 4, importance and significance of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's work. The first major contribution, which will always be remembered, is the coining of the word Pakistan. Pakistan, a separate state for the Muslims. As I said earlier, when the proposal was presented, it wasn't taken very seriously. But 7 years later, that is from 1930 to 1940, 7 years later, when the Muslim League passed a resolution in Lahore for the establishment of a separate state for Muslims of India, the press and other leaders gave it the name of Pakistan, that it was Pakistan resolution, although the word Pakistan does not appear in that resolution. But this was described as Pakistan resolution, the name coined by Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. I think another important contribution is that he emphasized Muslims as a nation entitled to a separate state. He saw that state to be independent, to be separated from India's mainland. Another contribution of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali is that he linked Islam with Muslim identity. He thought, like several other leaders, that Muslim become distinct because of the identity and history and the culture which has been given to them by Islam. Therefore, that identity was important and it comes from Islam. In his subsequent writings and political activism, especially in 1940, when he created a small movement, he also talked about Muslims living elsewhere. The proposal basically related to northwestern India, but in 40 and subsequently he talks about Muslims living in Bengal. He also talks about Muslims living in Hyderabad, that is in India, not Pakistani Hyderabad, Deccan, which is now part of India. And he used the word Bang-e-Islam for Bengal. And similarly, he talked about Hyderabad, Deccan to be the Muslim states, to be the Muslim areas. Therefore, in a way, by 40 and 1940 and subsequently, he was talking about other areas where Muslims were in majority. For example, in Bengal, Muslims were in majority, and he talks about the Bengali Muslim identity and state. He talks about Hyderabad, Deccan, where Muslims were in good number, and he talks about another Muslim territory, another Muslim entity in this subcontinent. Therefore, I would conclude my presentation on Chaudhry Rahmat Ali by highlighting that he made a very significant contribution in developing Muslim consciousness and then suggesting the name as well as partition of India. This brings an end to the presentation. Khuda Hafiz, until we meet again.